CBC News has confirmed new information about Ottawa's trade talks with the U.S., talks that Mark Carney has called intensive.
The government is responding to the impact of the unjust U.S. tariffs with multiple tools.
The Prime Minister began this week talking trade and tariffs with U.S. President Donald Trump at the G7.
America's Northeast was hit with a perfect economic storm. Tourism from Canada collapsed by as much as 60%. $2.5 billion in energy cost hikes were projected across New England and industries that had nothing to do with Washington's politics. Breweries, hotels, small contractors started bleeding jobs. While President Trump shook hands with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the G7 and spoke of a new trade deal, governors back home were facing a harsh reality. Tariffs meant to punish Ottawa were backfiring on Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, and New York. The costs weren't abstract. They showed up in canceled hotel bookings, rising heating bills, and halted housing projects. And as Washington stayed quiet, it was local American leaders who stepped in, meeting with Canadian premiers, drafting new energy partnerships, and trying to stop the fallout from a trade war they never asked for. The numbers were brutal and personal. By June 2025, Canadian tourism to Massachusetts alone had dropped between 20 and 60%. Flights into Boston's Logan Airport were nearly empty. In Old Orchard Beach, Maine, a town that had long relied on French-Canadian families, the summer season collapsed entirely. Bookings fell by over 90%. Rooms that were once reserved year after year now sat vacant. And while states like California, Florida, and New York scrambled to roll out ads begging Canadians to return, promising, "We're not Trump," it was too little too late. The damage was already in motion. Across New England, hotel staff were cut, restaurant shifts slashed, and seasonal workers sent home early. It wasn't just tourism, it was the ripple effect. Craft breweries couldn't can their beer due to aluminum tariffs. Warehouses filled with unsellable product. Meanwhile, longtime Canadian snowbirds families who had spent winters in Florida, Arizona, and the Carolinas for decades started canceling RV trips and abandoning second homes. Then came the energy shock. Tariffs on Canadian natural gas and electricity imports triggered projected cost increases of $2.5 billion over 5 years, a spike that would hit families just trying to heat their homes. For small businesses, that meant higher bills, tighter margins, and zero federal support. And the real estate sector frozen. Affordable housing projects that depended on Canadian lumber suddenly faced material costs that blew through budgets. Construction sites stalled. Local governments postponed builds, and all of it stemmed from a policy meant to pressure Ottawa, but that ended up squeezing Boston, Burlington, and Buffalo instead. The White House saw a trade war. But for America's Northeast, this was an economic ambush with no warning and no backup. As economic pain deepened across the Northeast, Massachusetts Governor Healey took matters into her own hands. She convened a high-level meeting in Boston, inviting fellow governors from New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, along with Canadian provincial premiers. No press, no grandstanding, just urgent coordination. The goal, to protect local economies from a federal trade war they never asked for. Healey was direct. Canada is our biggest trading partner, and Trump is taxing our states like they're the enemy. She went further. If Trump can't get it together with Carney, then we will. That wasn't just a soundbite, it was a pivot. While Washington postured, the states were building practical solutions. Within days, regional leaders began exploring direct energy partnerships with Canadian provinces, planning cross-border tourism initiatives, and seeking federal waivers for critical materials like aluminum and lumber, which had become prohibitively expensive due to tariffs. And it wasn't just Democratic leaders who pushed back. Republican governors from border states expressed alarm as rural hospitals faced closure, housing starts stalled, and local businesses reported layoffs. The tariff war, once framed as national protectionism, had become a bipartisan crisis, with states now leading the diplomatic front line. While states scrambled to hold their economies together, the spark that lit the fire was coming straight from Washington. In early 2025, President Trump imposed sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian aluminum, lumber, and natural gas, a move the administration touted as protecting American industry. But in reality, the impact landed hardest on the very regions that couldn't afford another blow: small towns, border cities, and tourism-dependent economies across the Northeast, Midwest, and Sunbelt. From Vermont's ski lodges to Florida's RV parks, the message from Washington felt less like strategy and more like sabotage. But it wasn't just policy, it was deeply personal. Trump didn't stop at tariffs. At a rally in Michigan, he mocked Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney as a glorified governor and went further, joking that Canada would make a fine 51st state. For millions of Canadians, especially the retirees, seasonal homeowners, and longtime visitors who had considered the U.S. a second home for decades, the insult wasn't just undiplomatic, it was humiliating. The backlash came not from parliaments or trade ministries, but from the people. In places like Florida, Arizona, and New England, snowbirds started canceling RV reservations, pulling out of seasonal leases, and rerouting vacation plans. One Ontario couple, who had spent more than $30,000 annually in the U.S., summed up the mood we used to look for made in USA. Now we see it and we put it back. It didn't take long for the numbers to reflect the sentiment. Flights from Canada to Boston plummeted. Hotel cancellations surged by double digits. Restaurants that once thrived on winter and summer surges from the north reported 50 to 90% drops in business. Even property management firms in Florida and the Carolinas were left scrambling as Canadian homeowners either sold off vacation properties or left them vacant. And this wasn't a top-down boycott. It was organic, quiet, but devastating. Everyday Canadians were engaging in economic self-defense, not out of malice, but out of a feeling of betrayal. From withdrawing investments to changing travel habits, they voted with their wallets. No public campaign, no slogans, just absence. That absence triggered a ripple effect that Washington never planned for. Craft breweries couldn't get enough aluminum for cans. Tourism boards launched emergency campaigns. We're not. Trump read one ad in California, but it was too little too late. The damage was done. In a globally connected economy, trust is a currency, and once it's broken, even the strongest trade routes can unravel. What began with a few careless words and one executive order became a full-blown consumer revolt, not by adversaries, but by our closest friends. While domestic headlines focused on crumbling hotels in Cape Cod and beer can shortages in Vermont, something far more consequential was happening overseas. One by one, America's closest allies were beginning to pivot not out of protest, but out of necessity. They weren't just disappointed in Washington's tariff aggression. They were making plans for a world where the United States was no longer the cornerstone of global trade. It started with France. In the weeks after President Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods and reignited Cold War rhetoric at the G7, French President Emmanuel Macron was photographed not with G7 leaders, but with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And the symbolism wasn't just for show. Macron announced 18 bilateral deals with China covering everything from agriculture and aviation to large-scale digital infrastructure. This wasn't business as usual, it was a strategic reset. Macron openly called for economic sovereignty from the United States, insisting that European nations must protect themselves from the volatility of American policy. France's realignment was more than diplomatic, it was structural. Paris fast-tracked LNG partnerships with China and entered exploratory talks with Canada to diversify its gas supply through Arctic shipping routes, circumventing the U.S. entirely. For France and many European capitals, the U.S. was no longer a reliable energy partner, it was a tariff risk, and they weren't alone. In Berlin, policymakers who once depended on U.S. LNG after cutting ties with Russia were now placing early bets on Canada's Arctic corridor. German energy officials described the shift bluntly. Predictable partners are safe partners. Right now, America is neither. Back in Ottawa, Canada seized the moment. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government accelerated cooperation with the EU, offering preferential access to Canadian rare earths aluminum and clean energy in exchange for long-term stability clauses. Where Washington offered tariffs and threats, Canada offered contracts and certainty. And Europe said yes. Inside the Beltway, the alarm bells were ringing. Economists at the Peterson Institute and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned that the damage from Trump's tariffs would not be temporary. What began as a retaliatory measure was evolving into a global decoupling, a realignment that could permanently shrink America's share of international trade and investment flows. And the warning signs weren't abstract. G7 coordination was fraying. U.S. influence over global supply chains was waning. Multilateral trade pacts were forming without Washington at the table. Even soft power, the invisible but powerful asset that draws students, tourists, businesses, and allies to the American orbit, was bleeding out. You could see it on Florida's beaches, once packed with Canadian retirees, now eerily quiet. You could see it in the European press, where headlines no longer referred to the U.S. as leader of the free world, but as an unpredictable actor. You could see it in investor sentiment, where foreign capital increasingly flowed into EU green bonds, Canadian mining ventures, and Asian infrastructure funds instead of Wall Street. In short, the Trump administration's trade strategy, once touted as a show of strength, was triggering a quiet but powerful exodus, not just of tourists or factory orders, but of global confidence in the American system. The biggest risk: Washington may not be able to reverse it. Because when partners build new trade routes, draft new supply contracts, and create new security frameworks, the architecture of global power shifts. And as Canada, France, and China began laying bricks in that new order, the United States was still stuck handing out threats from the past. This wasn't just a backlash, it was a warning shot. And this time it didn't come from Beijing or Moscow, it came from Ottawa, Paris, and Berlin, allies, now hedging against the very superpower they once depended on. What started as a tariff war is no longer just about trade. It's a full-blown grassroots rebellion against Washington's isolationist playbook. From Boston to Burlington, state leaders are no longer waiting for direction from D.C. They're forging their own paths, making deals with Canadian premiers, proposing energy corridors, and restoring ties that federal policy threatened to sever. This isn't just politics, it's survival. Governors are stepping into the vacuum left by a silent federal government and doing the work of diplomacy themselves. They're not just reacting to Trump's rhetoric, they're rejecting it. When embassies stay quiet, town halls speak louder. When treaties stall, tourism boards and rail agencies get to work. And Canadians. They've drawn their own conclusions. This isn't about one president. It's about trust and whether the United States as a system still honors the bonds it built with its closest neighbors. Families who once spent winters in Florida are now turning to Portugal. Tourists who packed Cape Cod are now exploring Prince Edward Island. Canadian dollars are moving, and so is loyalty. This wasn't a Cold War. It was a quiet collapse. And the loudest voices of resistance didn't come from Washington. They came from governors, small business owners, and the communities watching their local economies unravel in real time. The question now is simple but urgent. Is this just a state-level workaround or the beginning of a real U.S.-Canada fracture? Are we only losing tourists, or are we losing trust partners and geopolitical ground? Drop your take in the comments. Are we entering a new era of subnational diplomacy? Subscribe for more no-spin, ground-up reporting on how trade wars and politics are reshaping the world. One town, one governor, one decision at a time. Like this video if you believe real diplomacy doesn't wait for permission from Washington.